viewers, I am Suchibrata Goswami and I am a faculty at Tezpur University. Today I am going to discuss a topic or I am going to deliver my talk on a topic which may be useful for the students of graduate and postgraduate level. For my discussion, I have taken a few works of fiction which are frequently prescribed in our colleges and universities for the students of English literature. The intention of looking into this text is to see how these works of fiction, behind very simple looking domestic storyline, deals with a strong imperialist ideology, and by doing that, directly or indirectly, help in propagating colonial enterprise that embroiled the whole of 18th and 19th century England. For the purpose of my discussion, I have selected few texts that were written in 18th and 19th century. One, I would like to take Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. The other two texts which I will discuss are Mansfield Park and Pride and Prejudice, written by Jane Austen, and another novel which is actually less discussed from the point of view of from which I want to discuss, is David Copperfield, written by Charles Dickens. Now, two things I would like to see in these novels. One, which I have already mentioned probably, that how these novels have a strong colonial subtext within them. And other is how Robinson Crusoe, which was written long back in 1719, is a novel that went on inspiring other texts even after 100 years or more of the publication of this novel as a model of British imperialist project. Now the question is, did Defoe or Austen or Dickens write their novels explicitly revealing their inclination towards imperialist ideology or colonial venture of Britain? Even if it is so, nowhere in the novels any of the authors directly expressed their support for Britain's project of territorial expansion through colonies and its subsequent reflections in the home front. Now, it is in the post-colonial criticism and theory that a reaction against these texts arose when Edward Said, whom all of us actually know, one of the prominent pioneer of post-colonial studies, published his book Orientalism, that was in 1978. Post-colonial reading challenged the given meanings of a text and established that while using Britain's colonial enterprise as the setting of their narratives, such novels also participated in the construction and propagation of colonial ideology by providing an implicit justification for British imperialism. This critical study also declared how the reality of colonialism enters these texts as the necessary background rather than an accidental reflection. Edward Said, Govt Recibiva, Homi Bhabha, after Said actually, these are some very prominent critics in the areas who had a lot of influence in proving this fact. Now, what is post-colonial studies? The critical analysis of the history, culture, literature and modes of discourses that are specific to the former colonies of England, France, Spain and other European imperial powers. That is what is one of the primary objectives of post-colonial studies to see. These studies have focused especially on the third world countries in Africa, Asia and Caribbean islands, and South America also. However, the scope of such analysis is extended to the discourse and cultural productions of countries such as Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and such like. Postcolonial studies is a critical theory that examines both colonial subjugation and the impact of that subjugation on ethnic identities, even after the colonized states have achieved independence from the empire. If it is so, the post within inverted comma in the word post-colonial may suggest a concern only with the states after independence. Postcolonial studies examines all the mechanisms whereby imperial colonialism functioned in the past as well as its after effects in the present. With the advent of postcolonial studies as a critical theory, aspects of British literature in the 18th and 19th centuries viewed through a perspective that reveals the way in which the social and economic life represented in literature was tacitly underwritten by colonial exploitation. Now we will see what exactly Side's Orientalism says, or Side want to speak in true Orientalism regarding imperial and colonial ideology. Now, colonialism is not only a concept but also a socio-political construct or practice, we can say. This practice or this image of colonialism is constructed with false ideas, false images that relate with colonizers' ideology. In this concept or in this construct, you can say, West is always projected as the superior self, whereas the East is the other, we say, or the inferior other, or in other words we can call it, or it is said as subalterns. Now, subjugation, domination, profit and power are dominant features of colonialism. Means the Westerners tried to establish their superiority by means of all these practices that they had applied in the colonial states. Now, in particular, again, if we come back to from Western concept to broader European concept to the British, it can be said or viewed as an assertion of Englishness or Britishness and the superiority of that Britishness through these colonial ideologies. Now I'll come back to the text, because this idea of postcolonial study was important because we are going to see the text now from this point of view. First, as I had told, I'll start with Robinson Crusoe, which was one of the earliest of novels that was written in 1719, in a very early part of 18th century. And like many, I do find a strong link of Robinson Crusoe with many other texts written almost after 100 years of the publication of this representative classic of fictional genre. Robinson Crusoe is considered as the pioneering novel in many ways, but for most of all, for its explicit and implicit references of imperialist ideology, primarily reflected through the delineation of colonial situation. Now what happens in Robinson Crusoe? We all know the story because from our early days we used to read this novel as an adventure story primarily, without peeping deep into the meanings of the text. So if we go to the story, what we find that Crusoe actually goes out in an adventure journey through the seas. Then he reaches Brazil, where he buys a sugar plantation in one of the islands, and he becomes rich person. To extend his or expand his empire in this sugar plantation, he tries to bring more manpower, more workers to the plantation in Brazil, and with that intention he goes to Africa again, and what we call slave trading actually. That is for the purpose of bringing more and more people from Africa. He goes on another sea voyage. During this journey, Crusoe's ship was wrecked and he landed in an island. He encounters islanders, whom Defoe describes as savages. They are savage because they are flesh eaters, or maybe they are not like people who behaves like Crusoe in the island. After that, Crusoe, after staying for a long period in the island, Crusoe meets another man whose identity is purely given by Crusoe, or we do not have much idea about this person, but then what we know about this person is his name is Friday, a name which was given by Crusoe. And apart from a name, Crusoe also converts him into Protestant, means a Christian actually, from a flesh eater or from that savage condition. And then as he is adopted to Christianity, he becomes a civilized person. And his process of civilization constitutes a major portion in the novel. This is important to see. Crusoe also undertakes Friday's religious education, then converts him, tells him how to behave in a civilized society in terms of the behavior of the people in Crusoe's own land, and finally, in doing so, he takes he assumes what you can say, the image of a savior, which is typical of colonial images, the concept of Englishman as savior. This is what the basic storyline is, but underneath this story, there are many things which needs really careful attention. This is also a story which talks about sugar plantation, buying of slaves, human transportation, because at the end of the novel, when we find that Crusoe comes back to England, he sends some women to that island which he possessed, which he actually converted into a colonial place of which he is the owner, and he transported among many other goods, actually some women to that island, which means the full transformation of that isolated island to a place over which Crusoe can rule. Here we have encountered Crusoe's, and also we can say by extension Defoe's utilitarianism, which is a very much capitalist point of view or capitalist in nature, which is another very important aspect of colonial ideology. At the end of the novel, Crusoe comes back to England, finds himself a very wealthier person, a very rich person, by dint of his sugar plantation in Brazil, by dint of the people he borrowed from other lands to work in his plantation, and by dint of that isolated island that he had converted into a place to which he had transported women for more and more people to produce, and he becomes the owner. Another sense, he becomes the owner of that land too. Now, what is so unique about this novel? What I find so unique about this novel is the novelist's capability to create an imaginary colonial scene in the island. Why imaginary colonial scene? Because readers of Defoe might be well aware of the fact that Defoe had no direct experience of oceanic voyages than South American coastal people, no experience of the happenings in plantations, slave trade also, you can say, or overall a colonial economy. What can be the nature of a colonial economy? That we find from the reading of Defoe. His depiction of the whole situation can be said to come from either from his imagination or the information he gathered or he had from the travel narratives, different trade writings, and writings on the geographies. So practically Defoe never had this kind of experience. In spite of that, he presented a very convincing scenario of colonization in the shape of Crusoe and in the shape of that island. But the novel never allows us to sense that we are dealing with an imagined colonialism, that the entire engagement is wholly fiction. But the most important job Robinson Crusoe does is to engage its age and even beyond in a mental journey that merely resembles the experience of colonialism that never fades. The most important message that the novel delivers is how reliant Crusoe's self-image as an Englishman is on the colonial setting of the novel. Crusoe gradually learns how to assert himself over the land and the people. In short, the colonial setting facilitates Crusoe's individualism as he comes to recognize the unique place he occupies as an Englishman. These are the two important impact actually this novel left behind for the people of its age, also for the people after its age. Now, Defoe's belief in the character of Crusoe, or in painting the character of Crusoe, as we have already said, that Defoe never had a physical experience of any colonization or in colonial experience. Then how come he created such a convincing scenario in his novel, a setting in his novel? It is almost obvious because if we go through the passages of a book written by Defoe, The Complete English Gentleman, this passage will reveal Defoe's fate that English gentlemen can take possession of the world through reading alone. Very importantly, it resembles Defoe's own ideology or own depiction of Robinson Crusoe, Crusoe as the savior, Crusoe as the supreme English soul, and Crusoe as a person who is capable of doing anything. From this passage, we can understand Defoe's ideology also, that by only reading, an Englishman can make himself capable of capable of proving himself as a superior soul or superior human being than the others, that is subaltern in colonial context. But in implication, he meant the supremacy of an English man anywhere in the world. Now I'll simply read this extract from this particular book written by Defoe, The Complete English Gentleman. Here he says, the English gentleman can make the tour of the world in books. He may make himself master of geography of the universe in the maps, atlases, and measurements of our mathematicians. He may go round the globe with Dampier and Rogers. He may make all distant places near to him in his reviewing the voyages of those that saw them. With this difference too in his knowledge, and infinitely to his advantage, that those travelers, voyagers, survivors, etc. know about every man his share, but he receives the idea of the whole at one view. And it clearly reflects Defoe's fate on his fellow Englishmen, also Imperial's ideology of an Englishman as superior to all human beings in this world. Now, this concept of supreme power of English is an essential inspiration of colonial venture that Defoe propagated. Later on, we will see in different novels which I have taken up for this discussion how this ideology of Defoe that was reflected in Robinson Crusoe also reflected in other texts. Now I will come to Jane Austen's much discussed novel in this area is Mansfield Park, which I call a theory in practice, theory of Defoe, and practice is in Mansfield Park. Now, what is the story of Mansfield Park? We know, apparently, it is the story of Fanny Price and her ups and downs in the life in Mansfield Park. Mansfield Park is an estate. It's a very rich people. Mr. Bertram's estate, which also is the name of the novel. It is also seen as the journey of self. Apparently, the novel tells this story actually. It is the story of Fanny Price in Mansfield Park, this estate called Mansfield Park, ups and downs, and the self-making process of Fanny Price. But what is very tacitly interwoven with this text is the reality of imperial idealism. Mansfield Park is one of the most discussed novels from post-colonial point of view. Now, I find this novel is a unique example of materialization of the imaginative colonization of Defoe in Robinson Crusoe. if we call Robinson Crusoe an experiment of colonial strategy, then Mansfield Park is certainly the example of that experiment in practice. In other words, Mansfield Park can be called a miniature Britain, which is rich, comfortable and powerful by dint of the resources of another land and hard work of other people. Here Crusoe's sugar plantation or the island he owns can be replaced with Antigua, the island that nourishes Mansfield Park. We have two places in this novel. One is Antigua, that is far off place from England, an overseas island, where there is the sugar plantation of Mr. Bertram, and the earnings of Antigua is the complete source of comfort and luxury in the estate which he owns in England, that is Mansfield Park. Now, Antigua can be compared with any colonized land, including Crusoe's sugar plantation in Brazil or the island. So, Antigua now becomes a symbol of any colonized land, not only Antigua in particular. Now, what happens in Antigua? It is not the British that works there, but like Crusoe, they make best use of native people or slaves borrowed from other unprivileged areas. Antigua is, in other words, full of Crusoe's Fridays. Friday, the person whom Crusoe civilizes, and then in the name of civilization, in the name of giving him a name, in the name of saving him from the island inhabitants, Crusoe actually and finally makes Friday his slave, a subject of his direction. That is what Friday is. So Friday doesn't have any independence in the novel. Friday is completely turned into an entity that can work under the order and supervision of Crusoe. So Antigua is also a place where all these, whatever had happened in Crusoe's island, is happening in Antigua. And the production that is taken place in Antigua brings all comfort and luxury here in homeland, in England, in the form of Mansfield Park. The residents of Mansfield Park feel themselves empowered like Crusoe by dint of their Fridays and rhetorically justify this subjugation as necessary. Now, why this acceptance about which the novel is very much silent? Because while reading this novel, we strongly feel that any reaction in Mansfield Park is always caused by some happening in Antigua. When the order disrupts in Antigua, the reaction is seen in Mansfield Park. When there is some ups and downs in Antigua, same ups and downs can be seen in Mansfield Park also. So much integrally related these two places are. Then how can it be possible that Antigua is never overtly discussed in this novel? And what is, above all, what is happening in Antigua is never discussed by any characters in this novel. And we know what is happening in Antigua by a question Fanny Price asked in one of her occasions to Mr. Bertram. And she wanted to know actually the question of slavery, the moral ground of the importation of slaves to Antigua. The question related to this moral ground, whether slavery should be there or not, why these slaves are taken to Antigua, and whether these slaves should be taken to Antigua or not. Now, we find the clear, or we see the clear sign of silence as a reaction to this question. Everybody very obviously tried to avoid this question and nobody replied to her. So as a result of that, Fanny remains silent at the end of the novel. Now, why this question was avoided? Mr. Bertram does not want the order to be disturbed by such controversial questions. This is the order, a balanced order in Mansfield Park. The comfort, the balance that is maintained in Mansfield Park is by dint of what is happening in Antigua. So very tactfully, Austen raises the question of slavery and its moral ground, but then immediately she restores the order by not allowing her characters to answer this question. Subordination is a requirement to justify their existence. Why? Mr. Bertram did not answer. Like Defoe's novel, Austen also demonstrates the mechanisms by which power is produced and maintained in domestic and imperial spaces. So, this is the reason, if this question is answered, if discussions take place over the question of Fanny, then there will be revelation of many things. So on one hand, the question is raised, and on the other hand, immediately, by not answering this question and avoiding it, and by making Fanny silent, then the moral order of Mansfield Park is restored. This is what happens in Mansfield Park. There is another novel written by Jane Austen, which is actually, I have taken up this novel because I could see some very interesting facts coming up after the reading of this novel. And this one is Pride and Prejudice. Now, while Mansfield Park was much discussed from the point of view of post-colonial studies, Pride and Prejudice is a novel which probably is not so seriously seen from this point of view. Because this novel is often discussed from the point of view of marriage and property, love, conflict between different characters in the novel because of love, marriage and property. But a very careful reading of the novel unveils many implications of imperialist ideology, of capitalist subjugation, and idea of imperial expansion in domestic level. This is very important. I want to see how the same strategy of the empire actually worked in domestic level, but because in the other novels which I have already discussed, Robinson Crusoe or Mansfield Park, it actually operates in the overseas level, in the colonies, that is in the far off lands. But the same strategy is applied in this novel in domestic level. So the more we step deep inside the novel, the more we will be able to know how the imperialist ideology of capturing, subjugation and expulsion that characterized Crusoe's project in the island is at the domestic level in this novel too, creating a kind of inland colonization I call it, or maybe we can call it as inland colonization. Same colonial process, but it is in the homeland. But before going to the details of the novel, we need to know that Jane Austen wrote in a period when England had been actively engaged in taking advantage of the Industrial Revolution. This period, historical period, is very, very important to understand what actually happens in Pride and Prejudice. Behind this simple, homely looking story of love and marriage and property. And as we have already said, that it was a necessary background which was in a shadowy form. To understand that concept, we need to know Jane Austen's period also. Now, because of Industrial Revolution, Britain was considered as the workshop of the world. That much actually Industrial Revolution expanded that way in Britain. And colonization of the far-off lands with prosperity and resources was a demand of the period. So it is also a period when England can see the colonial expansion in its highest form. Mechanization and mass production was what the Industrial Revolution had greatly facilitated, accelerating a capitalist economy. Increasing demands of labor force took the bourgeois to the farmlands situated in different peripheries of England. This can certainly be viewed as the domestic version of the idea of imperial expansion. Means from the center, people within England, they went to the peripheries, to the rural England. And what was the intention behind this rich people to go to the rural England instead of focusing in their own city and urban life? Now, before going to that, we would like to see what happens in Pride and Prejudice actually. We know that the novel opens with Mrs. Bennet, one of the characters, asking Mr. Bennet to call or to invite their new neighbor, which is Mr. Bingley, who had come to Netherfield Park, that big estate in the rural England. Initially he rents it, and then he has a plan to buy it also and to live there for a long time. That is with what intention Mr. Bingley comes to Netherfield Park. Then along with Mr. Bingley comes Mr. Darcy, another rich urban young man who is a friend of Mr. Bingley, and then he also begins to stay in the countryside of Netherfield Park. Now, two rich and educated higher class city dwellers like Mr. Bingley or Darcy assembling in a rural countryside of England and buying a huge property cannot be let go without a motive, especially at that time when this novel was written. Now, it was also a time when the enclosure movement of accumulating capitals and recruiting laborers largely needed in the industrialized cities was in peak. Means this is also not only the period of Industrial Revolution, it was also a period of enclosure movement. Now, what is enclosure movement? This is important because all these historical happenings have a lot to do with the colonial subtext in this novel. What I have called inland colonization. Now, enclosure whole movement was a reaction to the British Parliament's Enclosure Act that was passed in 1700, which allowed the common areas to be owned by private owners. Common areas, those areas where farmers cultivated and also commonly used, huge areas that they commonly used for their cattle and also for harvesting. So it means that there was no specific ownership over those lands. Now with the enactment of this Enclosure Act in 1700, Parliament actually had allowed private ownership to these public areas. Now this led to wealthy farmers, urban industrialists buying up large sections of lands in order to create larger and more advanced farming. This forced smaller farmers off of their lands. So very strategically, or very actually carefully, there was a invasion from rural England to the industrial England that had taken place during that period. Now, having lost their way of life, many of these farmers went to local towns and cities in search of work. This was important to overall industrial revolution because it helped to create a system that created a large workforce for the factories and mines, which was gradually becoming essential strategy for the rich inlanders. So we repeatedly call it a strategy because the farmers on one hand were told to work in their fields. They were never actually taken away from their earlier jobs. But the situation was created in a way for the farmers that they had to leave these areas spontaneously because mechanization and more earning motives applied by the owners who had owned these lands could not meet the needs of the farmers. So gradually and very spontaneously actually, they left their own lands. Now, what is the rural scenario of England in those days? This is also a matter of discussion because Pride and Prejudice has implications on these topics too. Now, from 16th century well into the 19th century, respectable wealth in England was accumulated primarily through the ownership of land. The land would be leased to the tenants for farming, and the land-owning families would live entirely of the income generated by these leases. The families owning the largest of these hereditary estates, which varied in size, but average was about 10,000 acres. So it was a huge, very huge estate which these people owned during that period. Now, income that was generated from these areas were used, or those are sufficient to create parks and manors, like we see in the Netherfield Park, the construct. These people could purchase fashionable goods. They had servants, lots of servants. Then liveries, that cattle and other carriages and other vehicles. And they could meet all the other expenses related to keeping a country in home. The most prosperous landowners also kept a town home in London. That, as we see in case of Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley. Both of them are coming from London. They have their own properties in London, but then they are, for some strange reason, but then this strange reason we have already known, they want to live in the Netherfield Park. And Pride and Prejudice undoubtedly presents this rural England, which can be very useful for industrial England too. When Netherfield Park represents a rural England, people like Mr. Bingley or Darcy represents that industrial England who is completely dependent on this rural England, or who is going to be completely dependent on this rural England, and to get the maximum from this rural England, they will go to any extent. Now, Mr. Darcy and Bingley are the appropriate examples of bourgeois who has gone to the countryside to settle their business. The intention of long living that is said in the beginning of the novel, that they are coming to live in Netherfield for a long time, is tinted with a strong color of capitalism and labor exploitation. By having possession over the lands of the farmers, capitalists like Bingley or Darcy not only accumulated huge profit on farmers' hard labor, but also possessed a large number of laborers to use in the industries and expand their capitalist empire. So they had taken full advantage of the Enclosure Act and the Enclosure movement. On one hand, they could own or possess the lands in Netherfield. On the other hand, they could enjoy the richness or the profit of that Netherfield Park, and above all, gradually they could have possession over the farmers who worked in the Netherfield Park. So this possession led them to use these farmers in the industrial areas which they actually have in the London city. Through this shifting nature from city to rural area, here it is a little bit reverse. You can realize that where colonial expansion always meant from England to the overseas areas or distant, far distant islands. In this case, in this novel, the shifting is from the urban England to rural areas, from the center to periphery. Or in other novels, actually, we see this shift from the periphery, from the center to periphery, and here it is a reverse thing. Now, rural areas allegorically means Britain to the colonies. Significantly expressed the nature of imperialism, which was largely proclaimed by Austin. This inland colonization or the idea of imperial expansion is reversed in Pride and Prejudice to that of Robinson Crusoe. How? While Robinson Crusoe demonstrates the idea of expansion from center to periphery, Pride and Prejudice uses the same strategy from periphery to center. And anywhere, anyhow, the idea is same. From periphery to center means from rural England to the center of England. This expansion is meant, or the what we can say, this slavery that is a common use in colonial context. Same transportation of human resource, which was done in a typical colonial ideology from other places to the Britain does it in case of the colonies. Same thing is in this novel done by Mr. or Mr. Bingley or Mr. Darcy in case of the rural farmers. One of the important examples said by Robinson Crusoe is the idea of foreign overseas lands as the promised land, full of resources and hope of better life a vehicle of change denied in the homeland for various reasons. One of Crusoe's ideas of making his empire in the island was to assert his individuality or superiority, which he did not find in his homeland. His wandering from one place to another signifies literary and metaphorically the same search for an identity, an essentially important identity of being an Englishman during 18th and 19th centuries. Now, David Copperfield tells the story of the ups and downs of the protagonist of same name, David Copperfield. Now, Australia, about which I am going to talk in relation to this novel, apparently constitutes a very shadowy background in the novel's narrative. It is vaguely mentioned in the novel, and as such, the place has nothing to do with the self-making process of its protagonist. Then in what context Australia plays a necessary background, as we have already talked, or the post-colonial studies says, rather than an accidental reflection, as identified by many post-colonial critics in the imperial text that we had mentioned earlier. Australia is, in this novel, the epitome of Crusoe's island in Robinson Crusoe. It is interesting to observe that the common impression of Australia in the early novels is as a place of banishment and punishment, unknown, dark, actually a place where nobody wants to go. It was as unknown to the characters in Copperfield as the island was to Crusoe. But in both the novels, the characters decide to try this unknown land once. It is because, like Defoe, Dickens made his distant unknown island, this is Australia here, a place of opportunities, embodiment of freedom, a second chance to live as a superior self, unimaginable for all in a class-conscious world of England. In other words, Dickens created an Australian dream for those socially marginalized British, the way Defoe created his myth for the people of his time. What happens in David Copperfield? It includes a list of characters who willingly or otherwise travel to the southern colony. This list includes, if you can remember, characters like Wilkin Micawber, an eccentric, constantly in debt, little Emily, seduced and disrespected by people in her land, Daniel Pagoti, a poor fisherman whose niece was ruined, Martha Andel, who is a prostitute in the novel. These are some important characters that we see in the later phase of the novel going to Australia. Interestingly, all these characters fall into three general categories in social strata: categories of socially or financially unfit, the fallen woman, and the transported convict. The shared feature among all these characters that none of them is welcomed in the center, the elite British society. In other words, they are the examples of empires, example of other that we have already talked about in their homeland by superior Englishmen. These are also the people who are considered as a stigma in the decent English society, therefore needs to be erased. In a sense, these characters are forced to leave their country by not accepting as social superiors. Thus, The novel blurs the borderline between voluntary immigration and enforced transportation, which we can also call slavery. Dickens very innovatively used empire's strategy of racial cleansing in his own people by setting up an Australian dream in the style of Defoe's Island, most appealing to the socially other British. They all moved to Australia or forced to move, the unknown land of promise, because they learned that wealth and resources of these lands can bring them back the lost English self or identity denied in their own lands. Dickens also makes this dream come true significantly in this novel. You can see it. This is not a dream that is vague actually in this novel. A remarkable transformation in one way or another, which is awaiting for all these peripheral British characters in the novel. Mr. Micawber rises to become the district magistrate for Port Middlebay. Little Emily could live the life of a respectable lady in terms of Victorian ideal. Mr. Peggotty reunites with his niece, starts a peaceful life in Australia. Martha Handel, who was a prostitute in England actually, after going to Australia, she marries a farmer and lives a normal life in a sense, which was denied in her own home. Therefore, it is quite natural that following Empire's cleansing project, Dickens never allows these people to come back. In the novel, we do not see them coming back to England again. Though Mr. Peggotty came once, he was made to return to Australia to live forever. Thus, Dickens in David Copperfield also implicitly supports the Empire's view of proper maintenance of moral order in the center, the centric social hierarchies. However wealthy, imperatives cannot reappear in the conscious mind of the Empire. Neither can they be remembered. Significantly, in home, no one ever remembers or wants to know the well-being of these kings, these characters that have left for an unknown land. This is the strategy of Dickens in this novel. But one common aspect of all these novelists is strict adherence to the moral order in the center. Domination, strategic silencing, racial cleansing are necessary components in the fictional narrative to propagate a strong and clear message of stable England. Gayatri Spivak, about whom I had already mentioned, in her essay, Three Women's Text and a Critique of Imperialism, said, "It should not be possible to read 19th century British literature without remembering that imperialism, understood as England's social mission, was a crucial part of cultural representation of England to the English. The role of literature in production of cultural representation should not be ignored." All the novelists discussed in this talk, explicitly or implicitly, supported the imperialist ideology. One of the important manifestations of this ideology is the patriotic or nationalistic view of England. England as superior and Englishmen as a superior soul. From Defoe till Dickens, imperialism as an important aspect of patriotism has been maintained by these novelists. Crusoe's confidence in the sea-tossed, lonely island, Austen's dead silence over the issue of slavery, Dickens's strategy of exclusion by transporting the socially inferior or unacceptable Englishman to Australia, never to come back again in the novel, are all colored with so-called patriotism, the glories of empire. But it can be well argued that these glories of the empire maintained by the later novelist is highly indebted to Robinson Crusoe, who sowed the seed of attaining these glories through the immortal portrayal of Crusoe's life in the island. I thank you for giving a patient hearing. Hope this lecture will help you to see many more texts from this point of view. Thank you.